It's not meant to be anything more than that.
Oh.
Yes?
Yes, I was just like, my favourite tweet of the day today on responding to that was someone who said, I'd rather back a transgender person fighting for my freedom than back some of the chicken hawks trying to take my healthcare away. I rest my case.
On the campaign trail, Donald Trump said, thank you to the LGBT community, I will fight for you, while Hillary brings in more people that will threaten your freedoms and beliefs. He is trying, Stephen, to draw a distinction between loving people of all genders while not loving them in the army.
Stephen's gone to sleep.
I just do not want... Trump is not my president. I think this is a culture war thing which I don't see. I have no interest in.
Actually, that's absolutely true. What he's doing here politically is creating a culture war where everybody reacts and we all have a debate about transgender people in the army, when what he's really doing is trying to take healthcare away from tens of millions of people. So it's actually, you're absolutely right, Stephen. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a culture war.
It's a piece of tribal symbolism, and I mean, I was in the territorials when women first came into the teeth arms, what they call the teeth arms in artillery. And there are cultural issues, and there are matters that I think have been glibly set aside in the interests of making virtue statements. And it's far too complicated to start and end in two sentences. And whether he's identified with transgender or not, I don't know, and I don't care.
If you're volunteering to go out and basically be a warrior and defend people and go out and fight, it shouldn't matter if you're male, female, gay, transgender, whatever. You're making a decision to serve, and there is no reason not to include you. It just seems to me that Trump his political approach at the moment is all over the place. I saw somebody do instead of having the red cap with "Make America Great Again," it was, we'll do something at some point and it'll be terrific. There's nothing happening, and so now he's gone, let me make an issue about transgender people in the army.
The US military, it's claimed, spends 10 times more on erectile medicines than on the needs of its transgender troops. Now, before we go, I want to ask you about Nayland College year 11 student Macy Sutcliffe, who dyes her hair a kind of bright orange pink. And the school gives her a tube of black hair dye and tells her to obey school rules about shades of hair and to use the black hair dye before she can go back into class, and her hair is now an acceptable dark purple. It's like they're focusing on my look over my education, says Macy. It's a bit different from the hairstyle stoushes. Do you have an opinion about student hair colour, please?
Look, you have a uniform for a reason, and schools have rules for a reason, and as long as those reasons are sensible, I think you've got every right to uphold them. I mean, we've had this other issue with boys with beards and so on like that. I mean, I think if the rule is there, you can see that it's there for a safety reason or a health reason, that you don't want long hair or beards falling into food or science experiments. Or whatever.
The school decides.
The school decides. But if you have silly rules, then the people do have a right to say that rule is daft. And I'm not sure the colour of her hair matters, does it?
All right, Stephen?
Well, I think it's just like school uniform, much the same, whether you let people wear what they want or wear a school uniform. There's pros and cons. I suspect that it wouldn't matter where you were. Someone who wants to have a fight will find a way to fight.
Stephen Franks has been on the panel. We're out of time.
Not sure.
Josie Pagani, thank you. Stephen, thank you. And we're back tomorrow. Thanks for your company, everybody. John Campbell's Checkpoint now.
Kia ora everyone. Tonight on Checkpoint, the sister of the man who shot and killed 2 women near Whangarei yesterday says he called her to say goodbye. Quinn Patterson's sister Gloria says her younger brother had been struggling with his mental health recently. Also, we have just spoken to a former police dog handler who was stabbed by Quinn Patterson 34 years ago. Also tonight, a Tongan family desperate to gain residence in New Zealand say their severely disabled daughter, who was born in New Zealand, will die if they are deported. The government waters down its planned changes to temporary work visas. And Materia Ture's benefit fraud, we talk to solo parents about life on that income.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batten tēnei. The sister of the gunman who killed 2 women at a whangarei property says her brother called her beforehand to say goodbye. She's told Checkpoint her brother had been struggling recently and had been seeing counsellors. The bodies of the 2 women have been removed from the rural property. Wendy and John Campbell died yesterday morning when they went to the house to carry out a property inspection and install smoke alarms. Lois Williams reports.
The bodies of the mother and daughter remained under guard at the Mount Tiger property overnight after a 6-hour police siege. The police haven't yet found the body of the tenant, Quinn Patterson, who opened fire on the property managers at close range and later shot at police before fire engulfed his rental house. A kaumātua has blessed the scene. Another property manager and family friend, Julie Pepper, says Ms Campbell was having trouble with Mr Patterson, who had denied her access and tried to intimidate her. This is Lois Williams.
A Tongan woman says her 18-month-old daughter is likely to die if she's forced to leave New Zealand. Maggie Tuanuku Awhe Lupetu'u has lived here for the past 10 years, but she and her family have been given until March next year to leave the country. Her daughter Mariah has a number of life-threatening conditions, and a team of doctors here and the CEO of Tonga's health ministry says she faces death if she goes to Tonga. The Immigration and Protection Tribunal says the child has already cost taxpayers over $250,000. The family is appealing to the Minister of Immigration to grant them permanent residency. The government has backed down on some of its planned changes to temporary work visas. It now says migrants earning up to $41,000 would be considered low-skilled and forced to leave New Zealand for at least 12 months after 3 years of working here. It earlier proposed a figure of $48,000. The Immigration Minister, Michael Woodhouse, says the changes confirm that higher-paid and higher-skilled migrants should be allowed to stay longer. He says the government listened to concerns raised during the consultation process.
A concern that the definition of mid-skilled for those people who were higher qualified and on a pathway to higher level jobs may be penalised by being required to stand down after 3 years. So we've taken the pragmatic approach by reducing that threshold, and that'll mean a few more people will have that pathway to residence if indeed that's what they want.
The Immigration Minister, Michael Woodhouse. Politicians are determining the next steps they'll take regarding the Auditor-General. MPs have received a report that assesses whether Martin Matthews is fit to remain in the job and also Mr Matthews' response to it. The report was ordered because of a fraud that took place while he was in charge of the Transport Ministry, despite staff repeatedly raising concerns with him about the fraudster. The Climate Change Minister, Paula Bennett, says making emissions targets legally binding and setting up an independent climate change body would not work. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright, is proposing New Zealand follow the UK's lead and make reducing pollution a legal requirement. The UK law includes carbon budgets that cap the total amount of greenhouse gas emitted over 5 years and an independent expert body which advises the government. Mrs Bennett says it's an interesting idea, but it wouldn't work for New Zealand.
We're very different than the UK, obviously, both in our emissions profile, also in what we use and how we use it, and our projections further out.
Paula Bennett says it might be worth considering sometime in the future. The Transport Minister, Simon Bridges, has been cleared of trying to improperly block a request for official information. However, the Ombudsman has criticised KiwiRail, saying the state agency appeared ready to roll over when Mr Bridges' staff asked it to keep a report secret. Emails released last month revealed KiwiRail reversed a decision to release a report after the Minister's office raised concerns with one of its executives. The Chief Ombudsman, Peter Bosher, is advising all ministers and state agencies to adopt a formal protocol over the way such requests are handled. The police have lifted the cordons from a street in central Invercargill that were put in place after reports of a strong chemical smell. They were called to the Haven boarding house in Tyne Street at about 2 o'clock this afternoon. They evacuated some houses and helped move students away from the nearby St Joseph's School. The fire service confirmed that the smell had come from someone using cannabis oil. The police are still looking for the culprit. It's 5 past 5. To sport, and the same Crusaders side which beat the Highlanders on a wet and miserable night at AMI Stadium at the weekend will take the field against the Chiefs in their Super Rugby semi-final on Saturday night. The Chiefs had made 3 changes to the side which beat the Stormers in their quarter-final in Cape Town. Midfielder Charlie Ngatai returns from injury, with veteran utility back Stephen Donald dropping back to the reserves, while the experienced Tim Nanai Williams comes onto the right wing. Meanwhile, the Wallabies captain Stephen Moore has announced he's retiring from international rugby at the end of the year and is handing over the captaincy to Michael Hooper, effective immediately. The Silver Ferns captain Katrina Grant admits she flirted with the idea of moving to the Waikato Bay of Plenty Magic before signing with the Central Pulse for 1 more year. The long-serving and long-suffering Grant was buoyed by the Pulse's success in the ANZ Premiership this year, after they made the playoffs for the first time in their 10-year history. Grant's recently moved from Wellington to Rotorua and says making a break with the Pulse would have been difficult.
The Magic were obviously closer and things, but they've got a great defensive line up there, and at my sometimes you don't really know if you want to leave and have to set up shop and start somewhere else afresh. And I like to be loyal, and I'm getting near the end of my career, and it would be great to be able to play out there in a franchise you've been with for a while.
Silver Ferns captain Katrina Grant. That's the news.
Plain talking. We asked you to get in touch with your worst bits of business jargon. Going forward seems to be the most hated term.
Emma's been in touch saying, please ban all use of stakeholders, please. I loathe that word with the fire of 1,000 hells.
Bridget says, I can't stand being reached out to. But the one I really hated is, we should open the kimono on this discussion.
Ooh.
I just think that's really
No, don't go there. We avoid cliches like the plague. Morning reports with Susie Ferguson and Guy and Espiner, weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, the Chinese trade statistics showing New Zealand sells its water to China at less than half the price Fiji pays. And after 10, talking frankly about where the boundaries of family life should be drawn with Michael Frank. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow, Northland to Taumaranui and Taupo, including Bay of Plenty. A period of heavy rain this afternoon or evening with possible thunderstorms about Northland. A few showers and increasing fine spells tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered rain developing today, then becoming widespread and heavy for a time tomorrow, with snow lowering to 400 metres. Taranaki and Taihape to Wellington, also whited upper. Periods of rain easing to a few showers tomorrow. Snow to 400 metres tomorrow. Nelson Buller and Northern Westland, showers clearing tomorrow. Southern Westland and Fiordland, mainly fine, but showers about the Fiordland lakes today. Marlborough and Canterbury, rain spreading north today with heavy falls and snow to 300 metres. Rain easing to a few showers tomorrow. Otago and Southland, showers with snow to 300 metres, becoming confined to coastal areas tomorrow. And the Chatham Islands, fine today, rain later tomorrow. It's 5:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina. Coming up on Checkpoint tonight, a child born in New Zealand being deported to Tonga, where there isn't the medical care she needs. An iwi-led pop-up virtual medical clinic in Pattaya, and Donald Trump's ban on transgender people in the military. But we begin tonight with the shooting near Whangarei yesterday. Wendy Campbell and her daughter Natanya killed by Quinn Patterson, who then appears to have killed himself. Checkpoint has learned that Quinn Patterson had previously been imprisoned for a knife attack on a policeman. It was 3 decades ago, and his victim, former police dog handler Bruce Howard, hadn't heard his name very often in the years since, until the shooting yesterday. He thought he'd moved on, but suddenly the deaths of 2 people brought the memories of that night in Hamilton flooding back.
It was a Sunday night, a night shift. I'd been at a burglary in Garden Place in Hamilton. And the offenders gave themselves up, and I was going back to the police station, driving down Victoria Street. And Skate World, we'd been told to keep an eye out for it because there was graffiti being painted on the walls. It was Skate World, was what it was called in those days. And it was the old Innes Tartan factory. And I saw this guy over there that didn't look like he was up to much good. So I pulled over in the dog van, and there was McDonald's party hats with graffiti written all over them. And I was just, to be honest, it was my last night of night shift, and I just wanted to get all my paperwork tidied up and get home, because as dog handlers in those days, most of the time there was only 2 of us, and we worked humongous hours. Never really worked under a 90-hour week most of our weeks. And so I just wanted to get my paperwork and get off and try and have some days off. So I pulled up beside him, and then there were obscenities written all over these McDonald party hats, and he had a pen in his hand, and I said to him, that he was writing it, and he started to get vulture with me, and I said, look, the easy solution is just give me the pen, let me see if it's the same ink or not, and we'll take it from that. And the interaction went on for, I don't know how long it was, to be honest, but there was a bit of interaction. He passed me over the pen. There was no indication of any trouble brewing. I marked the pen on paper hats, and next thing I realised he'd scarp it and run off down the hill on me. So I called on him to stop, and he didn't, so I got Cara out of the dog van. So we chased him down the hill, and I got to the corner of Tisdale and Radnor Street sometime ahead of Cara. And then Cara arrived, and she went to the bushes at my right and started barking. So I went in to... Excuse me. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right. What year was this, Bruce?
1983.
Amazing that it's so vivid for you. So that 1983? 80?
Yep.
Extraordinary. Yep. So what's that, 34 years ago?
Yep.
And
you
you
never leaves you.
Yeah, it's absolutely vivid, isn't it? It's like you're there.
I am. When it just unfolds as I start to tell it. That's why. Yeah. Anyway, he stabbed me under the bushes. Let's call it quits at that. And I got down to less than half a pint of blood by the time the cavalry arrived and got me to hospital.
So what did he stab you with? Did he have a knife?
A 13-inch Bowie hunting knife. I don't even have to close my eyes to see the flaming thing. It's a flick knife that opens out. It's 13 inches from the tip to the hilt. And in court, Dr. Clark was the police surgeon, and he said he could guarantee there was a minimum of 8 stabs, but it was hard to tell because the knife was being hacked around in me. And he said, but there was a minimum of 8. It could have been, I can't remember what he said the top figure was. Meaningless to me then and now. But I lost my left lung out of it. I had tests done a few years ago, and it's inflated, but not properly. Yeah.
He stabbed you repeatedly with this long blade.
Yep, multiple times. And I managed to overpower him, and I got the knife off him and I threw it away what felt like hundreds of yards, but in reality it wasn't until the court case when I saw the photos, it was literally only about 2 or 3 feet away from him. What I didn't know was I'd lost complete use of my left arm at that stage because the radial nerve had been severed. Oh shit, it's coming back. And I managed to handcuff him. It was only a dog hand to do because you're used to doing that because you've got a dog on the leg.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So you had techniques to do it, and I handcuffed him. And to be honest, he was so small, I stood up. By that stage, I knew I was stabbed, because if people tell you got stabbing pains, they've never been stabbed because you actually never feel it.
And you must have been losing blood at a rate, were you?
Huge rate of knots. And so I picked him up. He was so small. I picked him up by his belt, and I was going to carry him back up to the police station because it wouldn't be 100 yards away to the police station. I was going to carry him back, and I collapsed from loss of blood. And the only time a police dog is officially allowed to attack anyone without command is when they've attacked the handler. And so Cara came in, and from all accounts, she held him. By the time the cavalry got there, he just had the waistband of his pyjamas, of his undies left, everything else. She'd ripped every shred of clothing off him. He had bites from the top of him to the bottom. But she was what we call the soft biter. She never broke skin. He just had teeth marks all over him. And the cavalry came, but at that stage, my memory is non-existent.
And he was sentenced to what for this?
We went through, it was either 4 or 5 high court trials we went to. I was the very first time, and as I understood it in police legal history, that I was flown to the Court of Appeal in Wellington and had to give evidence. Usually that was just lawyers arguing, but I went there and the judges granted another retrial. It was 4 or 5 I went through. I had to relive it, and in the end, the final judge says we're going to convict him on grievous bodily harm because he was being done for attempted murder on me, because during it he kept telling me he was going to kill me with a few adjectives wrapped around it. And, it was, and he got sentenced to 18 months in prison, but because they get time off, they don't even do the full sentence. And I was living in Taumudu. I had a prison officer live next door to me, and he came and told me that he had been released on bail and he was on parole, and he'd done a runner, he'd fled the country. So, the nightmares I had from that night, I had nightmares for 4 to 5 years from it.
Boy, it's raw still, isn't it, for you? I mean, you almost bled to death.
Yeah, I was down to half a pint of blood, the doctors told me. It took me over 10 years, probably more than 10 years, that if I was in someone's home and they swung around in the kitchen talking, holding the knife, that I wouldn't fall apart. So, what for me it was I stopped being a policeman that night, and I was just a victim like any other victim of a serious crime.
It's former police dog handler Bruce Howard, who was the victim of a knife attack by Quinn Patterson in 1983. Quinn Patterson disappeared after his release from prison and then reappeared in Northland, although Bruce Howard didn't know that until yesterday. He was known to police but seems to have avoided serious issues in the 3 decades since. His sister said he'd been relatively fine until recently, when his mental state started to deteriorate sharply. And yesterday at about 11:30, he called her cell phone and left her a message, although, as she told me this afternoon, she didn't hear it until sometime later.
Yes, he did call me, yeah. I didn't get to speak to him, though. He just left me a message on my phone, yeah.
He had phoned to say goodbye. Terrified by what was happening and aware that police were attending an incident where she knew he lived, Gloria called to get support.
And I had a girlfriend here sitting with me after I asked her to come. And she got a beep on her phone she seems to get she's got the app with the news. She said, "Oh, Gloria, I don't think you'll want to know this," because she knew where Gwen lived. So she showed it to me. As soon as she showed it to me, I knew that was it.
In recent years, his sister says, Quinn Patterson had lived an isolated but relatively uneventful life. Gloria said he'd worked on self-control.
He'd given up drugs and alcohol 15 years ago, and he didn't touch anything. He didn't touch anything after that.
But in recent months, he'd become more isolated, more consumed by worries about his income, his personal life, and his tenancy. He'd become more cut off, speaking to fewer people.
Yes. Yeah, I would be the closest person to him, yeah. We talked at least once a week for about an hour. He'd call me and we'd talk for an hour. It's mostly about him, so that's how I kind of knew what was going on in his life, really.
There were good periods, his sister says, but fewer of them. And Gloria says he stopped talking to almost everyone.
Quite a bit of a loner. Part of that is his past has made him into a bit of a loner. But he really was improving himself until about a year ago. He was getting so much better. He'd been to counselling and stuff like that, but all of this just obviously became too much for him, and he was getting sick again physically. And he had a bad skin condition a few years ago that was really, really terrible, and it was coming back, so that wasn't helping in the situation. Not getting enough sleep and that sort of thing. It's just a combination of things coming together, really. And as I say, I became aware of it about 4 weeks ago, and that he was thinking then of suicide. He talked about the possibility of counsellors, and he just told me a bit about the last few times he'd been to some counsellors, and there didn't seem to be any more to go in that direction.
Gloria says she urged him to get help, but she says while she became increasingly worried about her brother, she never thought he'd harm anyone else.
And I think he just got to a point where he just couldn't handle everything anymore, and did something terrible.
Wendy Campbell and her daughter Natanya. Gloria cannot believe it. Whatever despair drove her brother down and down, she cannot believe he killed 2 other people.
I'd just like to say to the other family that I'm really sorry that they've been involved in this tragedy.
That was Quinn Patterson's sister, Gloria, speaking to me this afternoon. It's 5:20. We'll have more on this story after 6 o'clock tonight when our Northland reporter Lars Williams speaks to one of Wendy Campbell's very close friends, Julie Pepper. Let's move on now, though. A Tongan family desperate to gain residence in New Zealand say their daughter will die if they are forced to return home. Maggie and Philippe arrived here on work visas 10 years ago, and their 2 children were born in New Zealand. But 18-month-old Mariah is severely disabled, and the Immigration and Protection Tribunal says her health care is a burden and the family faces deportation. But as Jessie Chang reports, Tonga doesn't have the facilities to treat Mariah, and her return is almost certainly a death sentence.
Little Mariah lies motionless on the floor of the living room. The 18-month-old requires around-the-clock care, has to be fed through a tube through her nose, and needs 3 doses of medicine every day. Her mother, Maggie Tu'inukuafelupetu'u, says while her 5-year-old son is healthy, Mariah was born with abnormal brain function and has a range of complex medical issues.
She was in emergency for a whole month before we came out home, and they said, okay, baby's got these conditions, she can't really move. She's got diagnosed with epilepsy, and the list just goes on.
High aspiration risk, severe reduced muscle strength, and a hole in her heart are just some of the disorders Mariah lives with every day. A list so complicated that medical professionals in Tonga won't be able to help her like those in New Zealand can. Just hours before our interview, Mariah had a seizure.
The occupation therapist came in just for a normal checkup and stuff, and she had a seizure that actually went on, and she kept rolling her eyes and just shaking her head and stuff, and we were close to call the ambulance.
Maggie Tu'inukuafelupetu'u has lived in the country for over 10 years. Her husband has been here for 8. They married here, had 2 children here, and made a life for themselves in New Zealand. Mariah was liable for deportation as the 1-month visitor visa she was granted had expired, so the family appealed to the Immigration and Protection Tribunal, which has given her until March next year to stay in the country. In its decision, the tribunal acknowledged the health difficulties, but also said Mariah's health had already cost taxpayers $250,000. The family has letters of support from the Ministry of Health in Tonga, doctors from Auckland Starship Hospital, and a social worker asking the government to allow Mariah to stay in the country permanently, due to the high risk she could die if she goes back to Tonga. In a letter to the Immigration and Protection Tribunal, Mariah's developmental paediatrician explained how serious her condition is.
Mariah needs the care that can be provided through a tertiary children's hospital, and it is very likely that she would die if the family were forced to return to Tonga. In my opinion, it is essential for Mariah's care that she remain in New Zealand. I therefore strongly support Mariah's application for permanent residency.
Hello. Hello, baby.
The family have always been in New Zealand legally, whether on work or visitor visas. Ms. Tu'inukuafelupetu'u has worked in manager roles at supermarket chain Nosh, and her husband Felipe is currently single-handedly supporting the family as a vehicle dismantler. She says they're not here to abuse the immigration system.
We can't actually entitle for any kind of supplement of renting or anything from WINS. Those things we're not eligible for it because we're not residency. So, I know we're responsible for our children. So, yeah, my husband actually work, but after, get paid, rent first. What is the main important thing? Food. And, sometimes we had to live with $30 per week. So, that's the condition of what we actually go through with.
The family has gathered supporting documents together and are getting their local community to sign a petition to back them to stay in New Zealand. They will be appealing to the Minister of Immigration this week to grant all of them permanent residency.
If I had to stay here with my daughter and send my husband back, there'd be no one else to actually help me to support. I needed pretty much my family to able to granted residency to continue to find the best life for my daughter and also my son as well. He's 5 years old, and he would never leave her sister. He's like, Mum, I'm going with my sister. I don't want my sister to die.
A spokesperson for the Associate Minister of Immigration, Scott Simpson, says it isn't the minister's policy to comment on specific or individual immigration cases. For Checkpoint, Ko Jessie Chang, TNA.
Changes to temporary work visas. Under the final changes outlined today, migrants earning up to $41,000 would be considered low-skilled and forced to leave New Zealand for at least 12 months after 3 years of working here. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
The Prime Minister, Bill English, indicated on Monday the government would take another look at some of the immigration changes after complaints from businesses, particularly those in the regions. Dairy farmers raised concerns about the requirement for migrant workers to leave for 12 months after 3 years. The stand down remains in place, but the $48,000 threshold has been lowered to $41,000. The Immigration Minister, Michael Woodhouse, says the changes confirm that higher paid and higher skilled migrants should be allowed to stay longer.
But it did highlight a concern that the definition of mid-skilled for those people who were higher qualified and on a pathway to higher level jobs may be penalised by this, by being required to stand down after 3 years. So we've taken the pragmatic approach by reducing that threshold, and that'll mean a few more people will have that pathway to residence if indeed that's what they want.
Asked what constituted a few more, Michael Woodhouse clarified the numbers.
Between 6,000 and 7,000 people on today's numbers who would otherwise have been subject to a 3-year stand down will no longer be. They are people in higher occupation codes and who earn between $41,500 and $48,900.
The New Zealand First leader, Winston Peters, was scathing about the changes.
Well, it's unfocused, it was haphazard, it was knee-jerk, never going to work, and as a consequence they take the wrong areas of the country whilst leaving Auckland and the massive population movement there untouched.
Labour's immigration spokesperson Ian Lees-Galloway says the government has tinkered with what was a bad policy in the first place.
I think it has the potential to drive down wages. I think using wages as a proxy for skill is a poor approach anyway. What we should be doing is focusing on high-skill immigration, filling the genuine skill shortages that do exist in New Zealand.
Michael Woodhouse says the changes were never intended to restrict migration.
The economy does that, and the last thing we want to do is choke off the number of people to fill those 10 or 11,000 new jobs that are being created. But I do stress we do want to make sure that all organisations and all sectors are working hard to make sure Kiwis get those jobs.
The changes to temporary work visa conditions will be introduced in a month. Atu i te whare parimata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Chris Bramwell aho.
Let's go to the United States, where outrage has greeted President Donald Trump's ban on transgender people from the military. The ban, announced in a series of tweets, came as a shock not only to the transgender community but to the Pentagon, which is now looking at how it will be implemented and what it will mean for people already in the military. Bridget Burke reports.
Chanting resist and Donald Trump must go. Hundreds of transgender supporters gathered in Times Square to protest against President Donald Trump's decision to ban transgender soldiers. The president made the shock announcement on Twitter, upending years of efforts to eliminate barriers to military service on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. David Kilnick is the president of the LGBT network.
I'm sorry, but he's a psychopath, and he's delusional. And we have to do so because there are lives at stake. There are lives at stake. Our young transgender kids' lives are at stake. And we cannot rest for a second on letting anything that President Trump or anyone in his administration does that threatens their value, their worth, their dignity as human beings and Americans.
Transgender woman Jennifer Long served in the military for 29 years.
It was completely unexpected. I don't think anybody in our community expected such a message to come across, especially such a message that sets policy and affects so many lives. So we're talking about right now actively serving with distinction and honor. We've got 15,000 transgender service member serving across all branches. in all different job sets.
Transgender woman Barbara served for 4 years in Vietnam for the US Air Force.
When I woke up this morning and I saw the news, I was devastated. I thought we had come such a long, long way, especially in the military, which, as a veteran, I am so proud that I served my country. But this is a major, major setback for us. It seems like everywhere you turn around, there are people discriminated against the trans community for one reason or another, and none of it makes sense. We're just people like everybody else.
Mr. Trump, who cited tremendous medical costs and disruption for the ban, did not specify how his ban would be implemented. Speaking to a gathering of American Legion auxiliary youth at the White House, he was questioned about his tweets by a reporter. Mr. Trump labelled the female reporter very rude.
She's very rude.
It remained unclear whether his policy would apply to existing transgender service members or new transgender recruits. But Jennifer Long is concerned about the repercussions.
15,000 service members right now are facing discharge from the military. What do those discharges look like? Are they going to be honorable, less than honorable, dishonorable? What are the implications to them and their families, career soldiers that have, given their careers with distinction to now not have that job? That impact. How does the Pentagon react to that when making policy? What are the options and what are the shifts? Unless it's they recall the statement, which is unlikely.
The White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said the president had made a difficult decision, but one that was best for the military.
The president has a lot of support for all Americans and certainly wants to protect all Americans at all times. The president's expressed concern since this Obama policy came into effect. But he's also voiced that this is a very expensive and disruptive policy, and based on consultation that he's had with his national security team, came to the conclusion that it erodes military readiness and unit cohesion, and made the decision based on that.
But Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi argued the move outlandish. She said the Pentagon spent 5 times more on Viagra every year than for those transitioning.
The Pentagon spends 5 times more on Viagra than it does for transition-related care. 5 times more on Viagra. This morning's tweets reveal a president with no respect for the courageous men and women who risk their lives to defend our freedoms. This disgusting ban will weaken our military and land that it defends.
The Pentagon said only that it was working on developing guidance following Trump's tweets. For Checkpoint, Bridget Burke.
You're with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. It's 27 minutes to 6. Coming up in the next half hour or so, what's life like on a benefit? We speak to 3 solo parents, life without a doctor. An iwi-led pop-up virtual medical clinic begins operating in the Taranaki town of Pātea, and more coming up. We'd love your feedback on any of our stories tonight. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook Checkpoint with John Campbell, where you can also watch us live, or you can email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. Your feedback is gratefully received, and so too are the headlines from Katrina Batten.
The sister of the gunman who killed 2 women at a rural whangarei property says he'd been seeing counsellors in recent weeks. She told Checkpoint her brother called her before the shooting the women, who had gone to the property to carry out an inspection. The bodies of the 2 women have now been removed from the property. A Tongan woman whose infant daughter is likely to die if she's forced to leave New Zealand is pleading with the Immigration Department to grant her permanent residence. Maggie Tuinukuafu Lupetu'u has lived here for the past 10 years, but she and her family have been given until March next year to leave the country. The government says the changes it's made to temporary work visas confirm that higher paid and higher skilled migrants should be allowed to stay here longer. It's dropped the minimum annual income requirement for migrants from $48,000 to $41,000. But farmers are questioning why temporary workers still have to leave New Zealand for at least 12 months after 3 years of working here. Politicians have received a report that assesses whether the Auditor-General, Martin Matthews, is fit to remain in the job. The report was ordered as a result of fraud that the ongoing that while he led the Transport Ministry, despite staff repeatedly raising concerns with him about the person responsible. The Climate Change Minister, Paula Bennett, says the British policy of making emissions targets legally binding would not work in New Zealand. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright, is proposing New Zealand follow the UK's lead. The Ombudsman has cleared the Transport Minister of improperly trying to block a request for official information. However, Peter Bosher has criticised KiwiRail, saying the state agency seemed to be ready to do whatever they were told when Mr Bridges' staff asked the company to keep a report secret. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Which is 24.5 minutes away. Thank you, Katrina. Let's turn to business news now with Giles Beckford. And there are smiles in the milking sheds. Giles, who's beaming in from Wellington after Fonterra raised its forecast payout for the new season by 25 cents a kilo of milk solids.
And rightly so, John. Good evening to you. Yes, Fonterra's raised that forecast up to $6.75 a kilo of milk solids. That is a sign, it says, of the world market getting back into some sort of balance between supply and demand. Lots of uncertainties, of course, but it will pump another $500 million into the economy, and that, of course, will not go amiss. And when you add in the extra dividends from commercial activities, that's 45 to 55 cents a share, then it means that farmers are probably facing somewhere around $7.30 payout, which of course is well above break even for many of them. Yeah. In terms of business, it means of course that they'll buy tractors, that they'll be sowing grass and repairing their pastures, mending fences, they'll be spending and investing, and that will be good for those regional areas. Lots of uncertainties, as I say. You're not quite sure what might happen out of Europe. Wet weather, we've had a really soggy past couple of months, truly. And that's going to hurt pasture growth, and we don't know how that will flow through to production. But every reason at this stage for us to be, and for the farmers to be, optimistic about the coming season.
Thanks, Charles. I know you want to have a look at the impact that Amazon might have if it sets up shop in this country, or more correctly, Australia, right?
Well, the local broking house Forsyth Barr has done a bit of a think piece. They've stood back a bit. They're working on the basis that Amazon will likely establish itself physically in Australia next year. Talk is that they'll have a warehouse in Melbourne. Now, whether they will take it from being beyond just a warehouse to being one of their fulfillment centres, and they will also bring in Amazon Prime, which of course is their video and streaming entertainment service. And also they enter into the food market, as they have done in the United States, all of which of course is, as the buzz term is at the moment, is disruption. Now we would think that, well, you know, we might just escape from, because we wouldn't be within their gaze and we're pretty small fry, but it could have a significant impact. And Forsyth Barr suggests that companies such as The Warehouse, Briscoe, might feel the direct force in terms of competition as a retail entity. But Sky TV, for instance, might feel it from the Amazon Prime and the streaming service that would go in there. And you think back on it, if it hits the bricks and mortar retailers, it means shopping mall owners. So we're talking the likes of Kiwi Property, of Stride Property. They too may well actually feel a pinch on their earnings. So it's some thoughtful piece. It's a bit of blue sky thinking, but you know, if you're an investor, if you're thinking about where your KiwiSaver fund should go, if you're thinking about the challenges to your future investments and earnings for them, then this is the sort of research from a broking house which is actually good to read. It's interesting reading, and it could well be informative for you when you make future investment decisions.
And it could also potentially have an impact on jobs in all of those employers, and many of them are very large employers.
Undoubtedly, John. I mean, you know, that these are sectors, these are service sectors which employ tens of thousands of people in our economy.
What happened on the markets today, Giles?
The top 50 index shares were really boring, just up 1 point at 77.12. The New Zealand dollar a bit on a fly at the moment. It's just under around 75.5 US cents. Two reasons for that. One is the upgraded dairy forecast. That's always positive for the currency. And also a slightly dovish, softish tone to the Federal Reserve's latest statement out of the States. which makes people think that there won't be perhaps so rapid interest rate rises, so that knocked the US dollar a bit. So that 75.5 US cents, that's the highest in more than 2 years for the Kiwi. And against the Australian, we are at around 93.8.
Giles Beckford, our business editor. Thank you, Giles. Tight budgets, a mountain of red tape and punitive obligations is the lot of sole parents, which they say makes it hard for them to lift their children out of poverty. Green Party co-leader Materia Ture controversially admitted she'd defrauded the benefit system to make ends meet, and she's now under investigation. Ruth Hill talked with 3 women about their experience on the benefit.
Being a solo mum was not part of Juliet's plans, but she says her 2.5-year-old daughter is her life. For the last 2 years, the pair have been subsisting on the sole parent benefit, plus whatever work she can fit in.
Living in Wellington is extremely expensive. I get altogether from accommodation supplement, sole parent and working for families, I get about $480 a week, and my rent is $380 a week.
She has budgeting down to a fine art, but says it's taken a toll on her health.
I make sure that my daughter is provided for, that she eats, that she has nappies and formula, and I live on literally $10 a week for my own food. Last year, between May and December, I went from a size 14 down to a size 6.
She's trying to get ahead through working part-time as a PA, but Juliet says dealing with the bureaucracy actually costs her money.
Sometimes it can take 2 to 3 months to ever get an appointment. During that time, either you can say to them, well, just cut me off until I sort this out, or you keep receiving it, and then when you go in for your appointment, you have to pay back a whole lot of money that you don't have. They are currently taking $20 a week out of the money they give me to repay money that they have overpaid me.
Roturua's sole parent, Rena, who went on the sole parent benefit in 2013 after moving back to New Zealand from Australia, says it's easy to fall foul of the system.
You get so many different case officers, and then, they don't really look up your circumstances. Well, it's quite shameful, actually, when you have to go there and explain your circumstances when they should already know the circumstances from the previous interview.
Rena, who's studying part-time, recently switched to a student allowance after she worked out she was better off on it. She says no one at Work and Income told her that. She says people get unfairly penalised for missing appointments because they don't have a phone, and many struggle to pay for all the photocopying of the documents demanded by their case managers.
But I guess I'm more fortunate than many because I have a car, and I have access to internet services because I'm studying.
Olive McRae from Dunedin, whose children are now 5 and 12, is gutted to be back on a benefit after a couple of years working for a union as an advocate for people dealing with the welfare system. She says paid work meant not having to choose between paying the rent and having food, and not always driving with the petrol light on.
I'm now back in the position of being on a benefit, and it's a really scary prospect, and I look at my children. I do the best that I can for my children. I am a good mother, and it just saddens me that 30 plus years of neoliberalism has indoctrinated society to kick beneficiaries.
South Auckland lawyer Katrina McLennan says the system is punitive and weighted against beneficiaries, thousands of whom aren't getting their full legal entitlements. She says rather than interrogating parents about how often they're having sex, as some of her clients are, benefits should be based on what each individual actually needs. For Checkpoint, Ruth Hill.
16.5 to 6. Climate change has been described as the defining intergenerational issue of our time by the environment watchdog, who wants New Zealand's emission reduction targets put into law. In her last report as Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright is proposing New Zealand follow the lead of the UK, which passed the Climate Change Act in 2008. And as Kate Gudsell reports, she says New Zealand political parties need to get behind this.
Jan Wright says climate change swamps the rising cost of superannuation as the major problem facing future generations. Between 1990 and 2015, the UK's net greenhouse gas emissions fell by more than a third, partly because the UK made pollution reduction a legal requirement, whereas in New Zealand, net emissions have risen by nearly 2/3 over the same period. Dr Wright says it's a long-term issue and politics should be taken out of it.
This system they have in the UK doesn't take all the politics out because governments can still make decisions, but it takes a lot of it out. And that's what I'm wanting, a process that does that. because we can't allow what we do about climate change just wax and wane with political will. It's not fair on all our young people. Come on, this is their world.
The UK's law includes setting up 5-year carbon budgets, which cap the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted over a 5-year period. If the country's not on track for meeting a carbon budget, the government must say why not and what it's doing about it. The UK also has an independent expert body which produces annual public reports on how well targets are being met, and the government is required to respond to it. Dr Wright is proposing a similar structure in New Zealand.
You'd be putting your targets in law, Paris target in law for a start, and you'd work out what you need to do in different 5-year periods. And because you'd be setting up an independent commission of expert people to advise the government, and because they would be advising it openly and publicly, and everyone could see this advice, everybody could see the reason for why things were being done, and that would allow for much more stability over time.
Jan Wright says there's growing support for the UK model in New Zealand, pointing to Generation Zero, a group of young people from across the political spectrum who are pushing for solutions to carbon pollution. Lisa McLaren from the group says the idea is gaining momentum.
I think it is a no-brainer, and I think everyone can see that, which is really convenient for us in many ways, because it's hard to argue with this overarching framework that will get stuff done, but not interfere in the policies and watch each party and whoever's leading, they can make up their own mind of what they'd like to do to implement and reach those targets.
But for those hoping this might give politicians a push in the right direction, don't hold your breath. The Climate Change Minister, Paula Bennett, says the idea is interesting.
We're very different than the UK, obviously, both in our emissions profile, also in what we use and how we use it, and our projections further out. So, I don't think that actually setting up an independent climate change body would work for us at the moment, but I certainly think that, it might be something worth looking at in the future.
Paula Bennett says there is space for cross-party work to be done, but there's not enough agreement across the House and more groundwork is needed. Both Labour and the Green Party support Dr Wright's recommendations. For Checkpoint, ko Kate Gutsel tēnei.
An iwi-led pop-up virtual medical clinic has begun operating in Pātea, which has been without a GP for several weeks. A collaboration between Ngāti Ruanui and Northern Dr Lance O'Sullivan, My Health, could offer a future model for health provision in backblocks New Zealand, which often struggle to attract GPs. Our Taranaki reporter, Robin Martin, has more.
Pātea's last remaining GP left town at the end of last month, and since then patients have been trekking to clinics in Hawera, Waverley and even as far south as Whanganui for treatment. Now, so-called digital health deputies will use an app to examine patients and send their results to the cloud for assessment from doctors who could be based anywhere in the world. Ngāti Ruanui Kaiarataki Debbie Ngawiwa Packer says the iwi had little choice but to step into the breach.
There was an expectation that the health service we own in Hawera of 6,600 clients would take up some of the slack, for want of the right words, and that's not sustainable for us. We have difficulties with shortage of doctors in our own entity, and our priority was to provide quality care for those existing patients.
New Zealand aims for a ratio of 1 GP per 1,500 patients. In South Taranaki there are 6 full-time equivalent GPs serving 15,700 patients, or a ratio of 1 GP per 2,500 patients. Ms Ngawiwa Packer says the current model of health provision is broken and the government needs to start thinking of new ways to deliver healthcare to rural communities. She says the South Taranaki community is lucky that Ngāti Ruanui has been nimble enough to act.
Not everyone's got us. Not everyone's got the ability to mobilise quickly and have networks. Some will just sit there paralysed, and that's a real shame. It's a real issue throughout Aotearoa.
Ngāti Ruanui have partnered with Kaitaia's Dr Lance O'Sullivan, who Ms Ngawiwa Packer met at a leadership camp at Stanford University in the United States. The digital health deputies at the Virtual Medical Centre will be using an iPad loaded with software developed by Dr O'Sullivan to examine their patients.
There's a couple of young ladies, 2 young ladies in the Pātea Māori Club offices who are doing health assessments on people using an app and some digital clinical tools. and that information is going to the cloud, and in the cloud there'll be some people looking at the health conditions, deciding on treatment, sending it to a doctor like me, and then a prescription or medication will be going to a pharmacist in Pātea in 10 minutes.
Dr O'Sullivan says the pop-up clinic will keep its provision simple and safe and will not offer a comprehensive service. Nevertheless, he says feedback from other regions using the technology has been positive, and it could represent the future of health provision for isolated centres.
This is a model of virtual care, which is basically saying, hey, can we use some simple technology and have people's health conditions addressed in the cloud remotely by doctors and nurses that aren't actually in the same place as the patient? Now, globally, this is a growing trend. Locally, we can use this and apply it to communities like Pātea that are underserved because of, doctor shortages or nurse shortages.
Former Pātea Community Board member John Hughes was at the clinic this week and has high hopes for the service.
I'm really excited about it at the moment. I think it's probably one of the best things that's happened a while lately, and if it works well, it'll be a big thing for the future of Pātea. It'll take the pressure off the medical centre, which is always overloaded, if you wouldn't put it like that, in my opinion.
Despite his optimism about the Pātea service, Mr Hughes is not impressed with the state of health provision in rural New Zealand.
It's disgusting, and we need to have more people, and I know the cities are short of doctors also, but the rural people are disadvantaged that they have to travel just long distances, and to wait a period of time with a little child is not satisfactory whatsoever.
The Pātea pop-up virtual clinic will run from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday to Friday, with plans to introduce Saturday mornings and a late night on Thursdays. It's a free service, and Ngāti Ruanui hope to attract private and government funding to continue it beyond a 3-month trial period. In Pātea for Checkpoint, ko Robin Martin tēnei.
And Pinnacle Midlands Health, which is responsible for primary care in Pātea, has now also launched a virtual medical service in the town. It says while they search for a new GP for Pātea, nurses at the Pātea Medical Centre will examine patients before briefing GPs at the Taupō Medical Centre. The Taupō GPs will have full access to the patient records, and consultations will be done in real time using video conferencing technology. 7.5 to 6. The Crown says a father cocked a loaded shotgun, pointed it at his 2-year-old daughter, who was as close as 30 centimetres away, and pulled the trigger. The Crown prosecutor, Katie Hogan, made her closing arguments at the High Court in Auckland today, where Gustav Otto Svant is on trial for the manslaughter of his daughter Amakura. Our Auckland court reporter Edward Gay was there.
Gustav Sam's family were moving out of their Mangere home on the morning of June the 2nd last year. Friends were helping in the front yard while Mr Samp stood holding a sawn-off shotgun. He told the court he didn't believe the gun worked and planned to throw it in a rubbish skip. But in her closing arguments today, the Crown prosecutor Katie Hogan suggested Mr Sampt may have been showing off to his friends as he held the shotgun with his daughter Amakura playing on a sofa close by. He was also stressed by the move. He'd just had an argument with his partner over money, and Amakura had been crying.
He failed to ensure that the shotgun was not loaded. He failed to ensure that the safety catch was on. He held the shotgun in close proximity to Amakura. He pointed the shotgun at Amakura and he pulled the trigger.
The gun went off, killing Amakura instantly.
It is accepted that in pointing the gun at Amakura and pulling the trigger, the defendant did not expect the gun to fire. But the Crown maintains that he was acting out of anger or frustration or to scare her.
Ms Hogan said Mr Samp's admissions to police officers soon after the shooting were telling. They included the words, "I shot her," "I accidentally shot her," and "I'm a killer." Ms Hogan said Mr Samp's own evidence was implausible and parts of his story changed. She said he told the police the gun had been tested but it didn't fire.
Even if Mr Sampt had personally tried the gun numerous times and it had not fired, it remains a question for you members of the jury whether it is okay to hold a loaded gun near your 2-year-old child, to not activate the safety catch, to point it at her, to pull the trigger, whether that is something a reasonable person would do.
Mr Samp's lawyer, Phil Hamlin, said the Crown case was black and white and ignored the dangerous nature of the gun, including that it could fire without anyone pulling the trigger. He pointed to evidence from a gun expert who found it could fire if the hammer was pulled back and let go. Mr Hamlin said Mr Sanft denied pulling the trigger, but that somehow it went off as he held the gun against his body and reached for a cigarette.
His reactions, I suggest to you, are quite important. No one knows the consequences more severely than him. He's got to live with them for the rest of his life. He knew right then, that very second, that that shot discharged, when he saw Amakura, what had happened. The second he saw his daughter fall to the ground, he saw the body parts, he saw her lifeless, he grabs her and holds her, and no doubt wished time could be taken back.
Mr Hamlin said his client didn't run, but instead held his daughter for as long as he could.
He picked her up, he holds her close. He would have worked out, clearly, she was dead. And then he wanders backwards and forwards, howling and crying, in such a way that it echoed down Favona Road and haunted the police officers who were present. It echoed down the road his anguish, his despair, his grief, his realisation that he was holding in his arms his dead daughter.
Mr Hamlin's closing arguments were cut short by a fire alarm and the evacuation of the court. He'll continue his submissions tomorrow before Justice Venning sums up the case and the jurors retire to consider their verdict. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi ko Edward Gay aho.
4 minutes to 6. They call him the Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci, the new White House Communications Supremo. He's been in the job just a few days, taking the heat from the media and trying his best to get the Trump message out there as Trump wants his message out, despite the seemingly best efforts of his boss to govern via unannounced tweets. And he's already having to deal with someone leaking his White House financial disclosure document. He's calling in the FBI, but he's remaining positive, on message and loving everyone. This report from CNN.
Anthony Scaramucci won't have to scrounge for a nickname.
The Mooch!
The Mooch.
The Mooch! Hey!
Stephen Colbert said it 13 times.
The Mooch! The Mooch.
In a 9-minute segment about the new White House Communications Director.
The Mooch is ready to smooch.
Smooch, the president's behind.
I love the president. I love the president.
I love the guy.
I love the president.
Let us count the ways.
The way I know him and the way I love him.
But Scaramucci isn't saving all his love for the president. He's got love left over. For Sean Spicer.
And I love the guy.
For other White House staffers.
I love the hair and makeup person that we had.
Tweeted one critic, "Is there anyone, anywhere, or anything you do not love?" Next thing you know, he'll say he loves the fandango.
Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do the fandango?
Actually, Scaramouche is a clown character in Italian theater, and the fandango is a Spanish dance not yet danced at the White House. Scaramucci may not be a bohemian, but he rhapsodizes about love.
I love the president.
He even uses the same line as the president.
We're going to win so much, Christian.
We're going to win so much.
You're actually going to get tired of winning.
You're going to get tired of winning.
We're going to win so much.
You're going to get so sick and tired of winning.
Even when he merely likes someone, his feelings grow as he speaks.
I like the team. Let me rephrase that. I love the team.
Anthony Scaramucci is the Barry White of the White House. Right down to blowing the press a kiss.
That's a lovely piece of storytelling from CNN. Jean Moose is the reporter in Washington, relishing her work. It's 1.5 to 6. Lots of feedback coming in tonight. Let's look at that story from Jessie Chang about the New Zealand-born child who has been deported to Tonga because her parents have been here on work visas for too long. Many in New Zealand believe that any child born in New Zealand would, or at least should, have a right to citizenship, but are aware that many people have used childbirth as a tool to gain residency for themselves and partner as well as extended family. Morally, though, New Zealand has an obligation to this infant to provide medical care in New Zealand for as long as is required. And the sick Tongan child, surely the New Zealand government can allow the child to stay in New Zealand to get the medical care she needs if the Tongan government undertakes to meet the cost of the treatment, says Alex. We also spoke to Bruce Howard after the news at 5 o'clock. This was a man who'd been stabbed by Quinn Patterson, who was responsible for the shootings near Whangarei yesterday. And a lot of people have contacted us and said, John, please gently inform the stab dog handler that it's almost certain that he still has PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. His breakdown shows us that it's decades later he would benefit from proper counselling. It sure helped me to get clear of a much lesser trauma. Quite a lot of people are contacting us concerned about Bruce, who's obviously really still struggling to deal with the issues of that night 34 years ago. And Bruce is well aware of this and has sought and received counselling, and the issues just came back to the surface with the events of the past couple of days.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening, ko Katrina Batanaho. The sister of the gunman who killed 2 women at a Whangarei property says her brother called her beforehand to say goodbye. Quinn Patterson shot and killed property manager John Campbell and her daughter Natanya yesterday morning when they visited his home along with another man to do maintenance work. He later died either in an exchange of gunfire or in the fire that engulfed his rental property. His only sister Gloria told Checkpoint her brother had been struggling recently and had been seeing counsellors. The bodies of the 2 women were removed from the rural property today and the kaumātua blessed the scene. A former policeman who was once knifed by Quinn Patterson says he nearly died from the attack. The former police dog handler, Bruce Howard, says he pursued Patterson one night 34 years ago after he suspected him of writing graffiti, but Patterson stabbed him around 8 times with a 13-inch hunting knife. He says he experienced nightmares for years after the attack.
It took me over 10 years, probably more than 10 years, that if I was in someone's home and they swung around in the kitchen talking, holding the knife, that I wouldn't fall apart. I stopped being a policeman that night, and I was just a victim like any other victim of a serious crime.
Bruce Howard says Patterson was sentenced to 18 months in prison for grievous bodily harm following the attack in Hamilton. The government has confirmed changes to immigration rules, but has not addressed one of the concerns raised by the dairy industry. The changes are aimed at restricting immigration numbers and have been out for consultation. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
The initial proposals included a minimum median annual income of $48,000 for jobs currently considered skilled and forcing migrants to leave for at least 12 months after 3 years of working here. The government has lowered the minimum median annual income to $41,000 but has left the 12-month rule in. It was that proposal the dairy sector said would make it harder to secure experienced long-term staff. However, the government's promised to see whether work visas can be tailored to address regional skill shortages. Atu i te whare pārimata, ko Chris Bramwell aho.
The lawyer for the man accused of shooting his 2-year-old daughter in the head with a shotgun says it was an accident. Gustav Sampt has denied manslaughter at the High Court in Auckland, where his lawyer Phil Hamlin delivered part of his closing arguments today. Mr Hamlin said the gun was faulty and went off without his client pulling the trigger. Earlier, the Crown prosecutor Katie Hogan suggested Mr Sampt may have been showing off to his friends. She said he had just had an argument with his partner over money and the child, Amakura Daniel Sampt, had been crying. The defence will continue its submissions tomorrow before Justice Venning sums up the case. Wildfires are continuing to burn in parts of southern France, where thousands of people have had to evacuate their homes. The French Prime Minister flew over the devastated area around Marseille a few hours ago, where thousands of firefighters are trying to contain the flames. The BBC's Hugh Schofield reports from France.
To a passenger flying late last night into the airport at Toulon, the hillside fires are clearly visible a short distance up the coast, above the lights of the towns and roads. Conditions this year have been unusually favourable for brush fires, with little rain for months and now hot winds fanning the flames. Speaking after he flew over the area yesterday evening, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe said the situation was improving but remained critical. The authorities described the risk of fire along this stretch of the coast as still exceptionally high.
Hugh Schofield reporting. The Climate Change Minister has rejected the Environment Watchdog's recommendation that emission targets be made legally binding. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Jan Wright, is proposing New Zealand follow the lead of the UK and make cutting pollution a legal requirement. The UK law includes setting up carbon budgets that cap the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted over a 5-year period and has an independent expert body which advises the government. Climate Change Minister Paula Bennett says there's not enough agreement across the House and more groundwork is needed. The Auditor-General has called for an overhaul of school property funding because it fails to target the schools that need it most. A report says the $270 million schools get each year to maintain and renew their property bears no relation to the age or condition of their buildings. Here's our education correspondent, John Gerritsen.
The report says the funding is based on the size of schools, and that favours big modern schools, even though the ones that need most help are often small with old buildings. It says the Ministry's property management has improved, but it needs to explicitly link good property management to education outcomes. The report says some principals are unhappy that schools that fail to maintain their buildings are bailed out with big ministry-funded property projects. This is John Gerritsen.
To sport, Sir Russell Coutts is turning his attention to training New Zealand's up-and-coming sailors following Oracle Team USA's defeat to Team New Zealand at the America's Cup in Bermuda. The former Team New Zealand skipper, who won successive America's Cup regattas in 1995 and 2000, recently took over as Commodore of the Manly Sailing Club in Whangaparaoa. Coutts has been coaching and racing youngsters in the Open BIC class at the Manly Club since last year. The 55-year-old's longtime friend and Vice Commodore Harold Bennett says Coutts is done with the America's Cup and is now focusing on helping the next generation of New Zealand sailors. The Warriors will take part in a silent protest organised by the Rugby League Players Association against the NRL in tomorrow night's match against the Cronulla Sharks at Mount Smart Stadium. The Players Association sent a box of green tape to each club for players to wear on their wrists, boots, arms and heads as a show of support for their ongoing negotiations with the NRL over a pay deal. Brisbane coach Wayne Bennett has banned his players from wearing the tape. And the England vice-captain, New Zealand-born Ben Stokes, says they deserve the criticism they copped for their poor performance in the second cricket test against South Africa, which levelled the series at 1-1. The two sides meet for the third test at the Oval tonight, marking the London ground's 100th test. England won the first by 211 runs and South Africa the second by 340 runs. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Eliza Raymond from Good Travel. For people who want to burn aviation fuel with a clear conscience. Wouldn't it be better just to stay at home? Our changing world looks at a future populated by robots where the humans aren't dead and the robots are soft. And this week's cultural ambassador, Paul Barrington, aka DJ Below, presents another chapter in the story of techno music on Nights. Pump up the volume after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met service weather through to midnight tomorrow, Northland to Taumaranui and Taupo, including Bay of Plenty. A period of heavy rain this afternoon or evening, with possible thunderstorms about Northland. A few showers and increasing fine spells tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered rain developing today, then becoming widespread and heavy for a time tomorrow, with snow lowering to 400 metres. Taranaki and Taihape to Wellington also Wairarapa. Periods of rain easing to a few showers tomorrow. Snow to 400 metres tomorrow. Nelson Buller and Northern Westland, showers clearing tomorrow. Southern Westland and Fiordland, mainly fine, but showers about the Fiordland lakes today. Marlborough and Canterbury, rain spreading north today with heavy falls and snow to 300 metres. Rain easing to a few showers tomorrow. Otago and Southland, showers with snow to 300 metres, becoming confined to coastal areas tomorrow. And for the Chatham Islands, fine today with rain later tomorrow. It's 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. The man who shot and killed 2 women in Whangarei, near Whangarei, was a troublesome, aggressive tenant and known to police. Quinn Patterson, who was in his 50s, opened fire on property manager Wendy Campbell and her daughter Natanya when they arrived at his rental home yesterday. He died either in an exchange of gunfire with police or in the fire that engulfed the house shortly afterwards, following a half-day siege. Earlier tonight, we revealed former police dog handler Bruce Howard was a victim of a knife attack by Quinn Patterson back in 1983. Quinn Patterson was jailed for 18 months for the attack. We'll hear from Bruce again shortly, but first our Northland reporter Lois Williams spoke today to a close friend of Wendy Campbell, who was one of the first to hear of the deaths.
Property manager Julie Pepper was at work yesterday morning when the police arrived with terrible news. One of her best friends, Wendy Campbell, and her daughter had just been shot dead by a tenant when they went to his house to install smoke alarms. The contractor they took with them was also shot but managed to escape and raise the alarm. That tenant was Quinn Patterson, and Julie Pepper says he'd been giving her friend grief since she took on the property. He'd had visits from the police, and because of his hostile behaviour and from what Ms Campbell saw at the house, she suspected he was a drug user.
We had discussed that property a few times and the issues she was having, and she had indicated that he was trying to intimidate her, but her attitude was such that I won't be intimidated.
But had she known Quinn Patterson was capable of murder, Julie Pepper says her friend would never have gone near the property. The Whangarei property manager spent the rest of her day at the police station, supporting Wendy Campbell's devastated husband and helping police contact family members. Ms Campbell's daughter, Natanya, who was 37, had 4 children, the eldest at university, the youngest just 3. And Natanya had just begun working for her mother and stepfather's company, Seek and Find, as a trainee property manager. For Julie Pepper, the enormity of what happened still hasn't quite sunk in. She says her friend was a doting grandma, a much-loved wife and friend, and a popular colleague. And she can't believe she's gone.
It was unbelievable and devastating and that at the same time, but you just go completely numb and you don't really know how to react, and you don't expect to get up in the morning and go and do your routine job and have your life ended like that. And so no, it hasn't sunk in.
One agent I spoke to today said the problem of violent tenants has become worse with a surge in methamphetamine use in the north and in Auckland. Julie Pepper says she was threatened by an aggressive tenant just last week, just one of the risks of the job, she says. And another property manager, Robert Raymond, has sent his staff on a self-defence course. He's had 3 confrontations this year where he's had to leave to defuse the situation. He says the most recent was 3 weeks ago during a property inspection.
She was right in my face. I backed away from that to defuse it, and we left the property. She was throwing things, so she was assaulting. She grabbed the rubbish bin lid, chucked it at my car, ripped off the letterbox.
Northland's Police Chief Russell LaPrue says he's proud of the way his officers entered the Mount Tiger property yesterday despite the presence of the shooter. He says they formed a protective shield around the women where they lay outside the house before confirming nothing could be done for them. The bodies of the 2 women remained under guard at the property overnight, but they were to be removed this afternoon for post-mortems tomorrow after a blessing by a kaumatua. The police have not yet found the body of Quinn Patterson and say the scene examination at the charred ruins of his house will take many days. For Checkpoint, Lois Williams.
Meanwhile, Checkpoint has learned that Quinn Patterson had previously been imprisoned for a knife attack on a police dog handler. Bruce Howard was on patrol when he noticed Quinn Patterson, who he suspected was vandalising a property in Hamilton. It was a minor offence, but what happened next still haunts the former policeman.
Of any trouble brewing. I marked the pen on paper hats, and next thing I realised he'd scarp it and run off down the hill on me. So I called on him to stop, and he didn't, so I got Cara out of the dog van. So we chased him down the hill, and I got to the corner of Tisdale and Radnor Street, sometime ahead of Cara. And then Cara arrived, and she went to the bushes at my right and started barking. So I went in to... Excuse me. Sorry.
That's all right. What year was this, Bruce?
1983.
Amazing that it's so vivid for you. So that 1983, 80.
Yep.
Extraordinary. Yep. So what's that? 34 years ago.
Yep.
And you
never leaves you.
Yeah, it's absolutely vivid, isn't it? It's like you're there.
I am. When it just unfolds as I start to tell it. That's why. Yeah. Anyway, he stabbed me under the bushes. Let's call it quits at that. And I managed to overpower him, and I got the knife off him and I threw it away. What felt like hundreds of yards, but in reality, it wasn't until the court case when I saw the photos, It was literally only about 2 or 3 feet away from him. What I didn't know was I'd lost complete use of my left arm at that stage because the radial nerve had been severed. Oh, shit, it's coming back. And I managed to handcuff him. It was only a dog hand to do because you're used to doing that because you've got a dog on the leg.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So you had techniques to do it, and I handcuffed him. And to be honest, he was so small, I stood up. By that stage, I knew I was stabbed, because if people tell you they're got stabbing pains, they've never been stabbed because you actually never feel it.
And you must have been losing blood at a rate, were you?
Huge rate of knots. And so I picked him up. He was so small. I picked him up by his belt, and I was going to carry him back up to the police station because I was, it wouldn't be 100 yards away to the police station. I was going to carry him back, and I collapsed from loss of blood. And the only time a police dog is officially allowed to attack anyone without command is when they've attacked the handler. And so Cara came in, and from all accounts, she held him. By the time the cavalry got there, he just had the waistband of his pyjamas, of his undies left. Everything else, she'd ripped every shred of clothing off him. He had bites from the top of him to the bottom. But she was what we call the soft biter. She never broke skin. He just had teeth marks all over him. And the cavalry came, but at that stage, my memory is non-existent.
And he was sentenced to what for this?
We went through, it was either 4 or 5 high court trials. I was the very first time, and as I understood it in police legal history, that I was flown to the Court of Appeal in Wellington and had to give evidence. Usually that was just lawyers arguing, but I went there and the judges granted another retrial. It was 4 or 5 I went through. I had to relive it, and in the end, the final judge says, we're going to convict him on grievous bodily harm because he was being done for attempted murder on me, because during it he kept telling me he was going to kill me with a few adjectives wrapped around it. And, it was, and he got sentenced to 18 months in prison, but because they get time off, they don't even do the full sentence. And I was living in Taumudu. I had a prison officer live next door to me, and he came and told me that he had been released on bail and he was on parole, and he'd done a runner, he'd fled the country. So, the nightmares I had from that night, I had nightmares for 4 to 5 years from it.
Boy, it's raw still, isn't it, for you? I mean, you almost bled to death.
Yeah, I was down to half a pint of blood, the doctors told me. It took me over 10 years, probably more than 10 years, that if I was in someone's home and they swung around in the kitchen talking, holding the knife, that I wouldn't fall apart. So, what for me it was I stopped being a policeman that night, and I was just a victim like any other victim of a serious crime.
Bruce Howard, that was 3 decades ago. Bruce obviously thought he had dealt with it, but then suddenly, out of the blue yesterday, the name Quinn Patterson popped up associated with the shooting, and as you could hear, it was suddenly, instantly very real and very raw again. Meanwhile, Quinn Patterson's sister Gloria says her younger brother called her yesterday to say goodbye. She told me today her brother had worked really hard to deal with his issues. He'd given up drugs and alcohol 15 years ago, but he'd been really struggling with his mental health in recent weeks.
Quite a bit of a loner. Part of that is his past has made him into a bit of a loner. But he really was improving himself until about a year ago. He was getting so much better. He'd been to counselling and stuff like that, but all of this just obviously became too much for him, and he was getting sick again physically. And he had a bad skin condition a few years ago that was really, really terrible, and it was coming back, so that wasn't helping in the situation. Not getting enough sleep and that sort of thing. It's just a combination of things coming together, really. And I think he just got to a point where he just couldn't handle everything anymore. And did something terrible.
That's Gloria, Quinn Patterson's sister. Gloria said she was really worried about what her brother might do to himself, but she never thought he would do what he did in terms of shooting 2 other people, and she really, really wanted to say sorry to the family the Campbell family that they had become involved in all of this. 19 minutes past 6, you're with Checkpoint on RNZ. The final person to be sentenced over a pokie machine fraud has been characterised as a bit player who was unaware of the level of deception carried out by the scheme's leader, the racing identity Michael O'Brien. Earlier this month, O'Brien was jailed for 4.5 years for his involvement in the fraud. Today, his co-accused, Paul Max, was sentenced in the High Court in Wellington and ordered to serve 12 months home detention. Our court reporter, Anne-Marie May, was at the hearing.
Following an earlier investigation, gambling regulators had found Michael O'Brien an unsuitable person to be involved in the industry. He got around that by using others to set up companies to apply for licences to run pokie machines. Paul Max's role was to be the front man for some of the premises and conceal O'Brien's involvement from authorities. O'Brien managed the pokie proceeds through a company he set up and took millions in backhanders from racing clubs, which paid him to ensure they received grants from the trust running the machines. Justice Dobson said today he could not accept the defence suggestion that Max's offending was caused by naivety.
Your conduct struck at the heart of the regulatory regime by hiding Michael O'Brien's interests in a significant number of Class 4 venues. The licensing and monitoring system cannot function if the regulators are deceived as to the identity of who is involved.
Justice Dobson said he was also troubled that those who wrote references for Max seemed to believe his offending was minor or technical and not something the criminal justice system needed to take seriously. The Crown Prosecutor Grant Burston said the offenders deliberately tried to deceive the gambling regulator and suggested a sentence starting point of 3.5 years to 3 years and 9 months. However, Max's lawyer, Mark Corlett QC, said his client knew nothing of the money Michael O'Brien made from the racing clubs and home detention was appropriate given he was a first offender with an unblemished character.
And it is clear that he has for a long time enjoyed a good reputation in the Nelson community and that he continues to have the support of those in Nelson. He is remorseful. This conviction and his detention has had a devastating impact on him.
Justice Dobson questioned how contrite Max was.
Such claims are often rejected where the sentencing judge is concerned that the claim is made out of self-pity at the predicament the offender finds him or herself in, rather than as a demonstration of genuine remorse, accepting the criminality of what has been involved and committing to change.
Justice Dobson said judges' cynicism about the genuineness of remorse is often justified, particularly where a defendant promptly lodges an appeal against conviction, though he agreed to give Max a slight sentence discount to recognise his remorse. It was revealed at today's hearing that both Max's co-accused have filed appeals against their convictions and sentences. For Checkpoint, Anne-Marie May.
Coming up to 22 minutes past 6 on RNZ. The US President Donald Trump has announced via Twitter a ban on transgender people serving in the armed forces, saying their presence would be, and I quote, disruptive and their medical care too expensive. That sent shockwaves across the US with even senior Republicans criticising the move and pointing out that the tweets don't make it clear whether transgender people currently serving will be forced to leave. The ABC's Connor Duffy reports from Washington.
President Donald Trump announced the ban with 3 early morning tweets. He said the military must be focused on decisive and overwhelming victory, and it couldn't be burdened with the disruption or medical costs that would come with allowing transgender members. David Kilmanick from the LGBT network was among those to quickly express outrage.
This decision to force able-bodied, patriotic American service members to possibly leave the military will harm the strength and readiness of our armed forces and is already being blasted by congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle.
A ban on transgender people serving openly in the military was overturned last year, and it's believed more than 6,000 people are currently serving. It's not clear what will happen to them. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham was critical of the surprise announcement.
But I think the right way to do this is have a hearing so you can hear from both sides, have the Secretary of Defense and generals come before the committee to explain what their recommendations are, make a reasoned decision about those who are serving as transgender, what happens to them, At the end of the day, I want a strong, vibrant military, but I want to be fair.
At the daily briefing, new White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders couldn't say if people currently serving would be forced to leave.
That's something that the Department of Defense and the White House will have to work together as implementation takes place and is done so lawfully.
During last year's election, President Trump promised to fight for LGBT rights. Press Secretary Sanders says the decision is about military cohesion.
On that, the decision is based on a military decision. It's not meant to be anything more than that, and it's simply about, obviously, it's a very difficult decision. It's not a simple one, but the president feels that it's the best one for the military.
Republican Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler from Missouri was quick to make known her support for the ban.
So the question is, though, should we be spending any tax dollars to do gender reassignment surgeries when we have soldiers who don't have body armor or bullets? We need to be investing every dollar that we have to meet the threats we're facing as a nation.
David Kilmanick from the LGBT Network says it's really about discrimination.
The RAND Corporation has estimated that the cost of medical care for transgender troops is approximately 1/100th of 1% of the military's annual healthcare budget.
18 countries, including Australia, Israel and Britain, currently allow transgender soldiers.
It's Connor Duffy reporting from Washington. Let's head south from Washington, quite a long way south, Venezuela. The situation there is being described as a powder keg, with anti-government protests stepping up as part of a 48-hour general strike, which comes before a crucial referendum this weekend. Now, the South American nation, which is home to the world's largest oil reserves, faces a controversial vote to elect a constituent assembly whose job will be to redraft its constitution. The opposition says the vote could mark the end of democracy in Venezuela and give the country's president more power. The president is also under fire for his use of a hugely popular song to promote the vote. Temperatures and passions are rising, and there is a lot at stake. With more, here's CNN's Paula Newton from the capital, Caracas.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro tried to use the most streamed song of all time to entice voters. He instead provoked more protest. In an Instagram post, singer Luis Fonsi told the president to stop using his hit single Despacito for what he called manipulation and propaganda. But the idea of doing battle over a pop culture anthem seems absurd when an all-too-real battle rages on the streets. Protesters wage fierce street battles confronting the government over its Sunday referendum, a vote that could see Maduro granted sweeping new powers.
They want to strike more fear in the people so they can go ahead with their election. So we are going to do everything we can to stop that from happening. We're going to go every day to the street. We're going to go on strike for 2 days this week. Then we're going to take the capital, and we're not going to allow them to have their election.
We witnessed the intense confrontations, now all the more violent, as the opposition says it's fighting for the last remnants of freedom here. Protesters hold a vigil for the deaths of their own, more than 100 killed already in just a few months of protest.
Syringes, I don't know what, solution.
And Maria Cristina Rascos is getting ready for what's to come. A medical student, she and hundreds of volunteers like her prep ambulances, first aid kits, and mobile field hospitals.
The things that could happen are limitless. They're really limitless. It's getting worse. But because there are a lot of gunshots, not rubber.
These improvised medical teams save lives as the political stalemate worsens.
This is the way I can help, and this is the way I feel full. This is the way that fills my heart, and this is the way I really can help.
This week, Venezuelans continued their bleak ritual, lining up for basic food they can afford. With each branding of a number, more frustration.
Now, of course, this is something that Venezuelans are quite used to, lining up for hours for very basic supplies. But this week, things are quite different. The opposition has called for that 2-day strike, and in the face of that, many are stocking up as best they can for fear of the violence that is to come.
It's terrible. It's very hard. There are a lot of insecurity. It's been almost 3 weeks that we barely leave the house. The only time we do is come shop or stay close to home.
And for good reason. This week, more than any other in recent years, Venezuela seems on the brink of a defining political confrontation. People here are bracing for the fallout.
It's extraordinary times in Venezuela. Paula Newton is the reporter there, CNN's reporter from Caracas. Just about ends the program for tonight. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you for your feedback tonight. An awful lot of kindness and care and concern for Bruce Howard, the police officer who spoke and so vividly and in very raw terms recalled his experience with Quinn Patterson being stabbed in Hamilton 34 years ago. He talked about it as if it had happened just in the past few weeks. The events recalled very strongly to mind after Quinn Patterson was named as the man responsible for shooting Wendy Natanya Campbell and, of course, himself, it seems, just outside Whangarei yesterday. Thank you for all your kind messages about Bruce, and lots of messages about Ruth Hill's story about solo parents. The question we should be asking is why Materia should have lost her benefit if she had flatmates who provided warmth and support as opposed to having to live alone. The political games and even calling this fraud seem to miss the point. Where is our compassion as a country? Well, lots of you displayed compassion in your feedback tonight, and we're very grateful for it. That's Checkpoint for this evening. Thank you for joining us on your radio, your television, online, or however you choose to connect with us in the smorgasbord of opportunities for connection we offer you on behalf of our excellent team. That is it for tonight, but we will be back tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. The man who shot and killed 2 women in rural Whangarei yesterday was once imprisoned after a knife attack on a police officer. Quinn Patterson also died either in an exchange of gunfire or in a blaze that engulfed his rental property. The Climate Change Minister says there's not enough agreement in Parliament to act on a recommendation that the government make emissions targets legally binding. The Office of the Auditor-General says school property funding favours big modern schools and doesn't target the ones that need it most. The lawyer for a man accused of shooting his 2-year-old daughter says it was an accident. Gustav Samt has denied manslaughter, but the Crown has suggested he was showing off to his friends. The government has confirmed changes to immigration rules but has not addressed one of the dairy industry's concerns, the requirement for temporary workers to leave